All right. I am here with Ryan Burge, Jeremy Chin here of no podcast, just me. But I'm here with Ryan Burge. We corresponded online, and I really wanted to interview Ryan because I just read his book, The Nuns. And I wanted to talk to him about this book because I thought it could be helpful for, especially for people of faith, but really for everybody in understanding the United States and the broader religious landscape. But first of all, Ryan, could you just kind of share who you are, what you do in general?
Yeah. So I have a PhD in political science from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. I am currently an assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois. I also run our graduate program. In addition to that, I am a pastor, having pastored First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois for 14 and a half years. I've been in ministry in the American Baptist churches now for close to 18 years. I am the husband to my wife, Jackie. We've been married for 13 years, and we have two little boys who are 9 and almost 7.
Cool. Do you think you could break it down for us? The first part of what you were saying about what you study, like in a way that without all the big words, in case just the rest of us like what? From an ordinary person's perspective, what is it that you study, or what is?
I study religion in America, and how religious people act, how they vote, how they believe, about political things, but also just about things in general, things like marriage and family and kids and race, and I call myself a religious demographer sometimes because I do a lot of tracking of religious trends over time. But I'm just a general social scientist who is interested in things involving religion in America. And I would say specifically religion and political behavior, voting, public opinion, things like that. But really, I just kind of track down whatever I find is interesting. And, right now, I think the most interesting thing in America is this idea of religious disaffiliation, people who are not religious. Which is, it's growing rapidly now. It's probably close to 30% of Americans have no religious belonging, which it was 5% 40 years ago. And everyone seems to be, understanding this is a thing. This is something we need to be worried about, or at least thinking about. But no one has really been able to sort of, boil it down to a short, accessible book. And that's really what the book was about, was just trying to make a handbook, really, like a foundational guide on here is what the nuns, that's what we call them, N-O-N-E-S, the nuns look like. Here's what they think like. Here's how they vote. Here's how they behave. Here's how they feel about the world. And here's why they're important to America. So, that's really been my kind of, recently, that's been sort of my research track, is focusing on the unaffiliated and trying to help the average public understand what the unaffiliated are all about. So that's the book right there, The Nuns. You all should buy a copy.
Right. So I just read this. I blew through it. It was like a little bit over 100 pages. And I've been interested in this because for anyone who is a follower of Jesus, for multiple reasons, we should care about understanding the religious landscape around us, right? One, we want to learn how to love our neighbors as ourselves, right? And part of that is understanding what people's perspectives are on life, But secondly, a part of our faith is to try to share about Jesus, right, to other people. And how do we learn how to share about Jesus well? We have to understand how people are hearing us and what perspective they're coming from. And so that's what's motivating me to understand this phenomenon of the nuns. And but yeah, I want you to get into this a little bit more. Your book title is The Nuns: Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where They Are Going. So where did they come from? Who are they, and where are they going?
Yeah. So where did they come from? The answer is complicated. And I think in the book, I try to make that clear that it's not one thing. Everyone kind of says, well, give me the 30-second answer of where the nuns came from. And it's actually incredibly complicated. It's a whole host of factors. I really kind of bang through about 6 or 7 or 8 in the book. I think the biggest one is just called secularization, which is the idea that as countries become more economically prosperous and gain higher levels of education, which obviously the United States has over the last 50 or 60 years, they just become naturally less religious. And the kind of the prime example of that is Western Europe. Most countries in Western Europe are largely secular, we would say. Church attendance there is less than 20% of people attend church once a week or more. So America is still a lot more religious than they are, but it would be silly to say that America would not eventually become more like Europe. It seems like culture starts there and kind of goes across the ocean to us. But I also think it's more complicated than that, though, because it's not just secularization. It's also things like politics. There's a pretty clear, direct relationship between politics and disaffiliation. For instance, 40% of people who identify as very liberal have no religious affiliation, while it's only 10% of people who identify as very conservative. So, clearly political conservatives in America are more likely to be attached to religion, and political liberals are less attached. There's things like the internet. I think we'd be missing something if we didn't say the internet had some role to play in this. In the book, I tell a story about, let's say that you are an atheist in Alabama in 1950. How many people would you tell in real life that you were an atheist in Alabama in 1950? The answer is probably none, because you knew that there's just so much stigma against that word, especially in the South, especially 50, 60 years ago. So you might go your whole life and never meet another atheist. But today you can go online and Google, the atheists of Mississippi or Alabama, and you can find a couple hundred people who are just like you. And you can have meetups, and you can chat online, and you can form communities, and you can realize you're not alone. And by realizing you're not alone, it kind of gives you more license to tell people that you are an atheist. So I think a lot of it is not, they didn't come from anywhere. They've just been more honest with pollsters now than they have ever been, because the stigma against being a nun has sort of decreased over time. So in the book, I kind of say this is probably a good thing, because we're actually seeing the world for what it is, not the way we hope it to be. And so we're actually getting closer to the real number now, not the sort of the number that we wish it was, which is, everyone's a Christian, everyone goes to church. So
you took out the religious veneer, took off the church clothes.
Exactly. And so now I think, again, it's like if you're an alcoholic, the first step is, saying I'm an alcoholic, right? Like I have a problem. And I think churches are a lot better off by saying we have a problem, and this is what the problem looks like. So that's, and in the book, I talk about things like, the Catholic clergy sex abuse scandal, which I don't think is nearly as important as people make it out to be. I think they've scapegoated that essentially. A lot of people are going to leave the church because of other things. Abuse is obviously bad. I think some people have left because of abuse, but I think a lot of people left just because they didn't want to be part of religion, and they use those stories that happened to other people as justification for them leaving, which is, that's what people do. We make excuses for things. I also talk about other things like the breakdown of the family. The share of Americans who are married is lower than it's ever been right now. The number of people with kids who are married is higher than it's ever been. And we're seeing that those have the people who stay in church tend with the people who follow sort of the nuclear traditional path, right? Get married to someone of the opposite sex, have kids. Those are the people in church. The people who don't go to church, people who never marry, or people who have kids out of wedlock, let's say, or do have kids when they're married, but then get divorced, right? All those things are leading people to outside of church. So that's where they came from. Just sort of this confluence of a bunch of events, all came together. And really the early 1990s was like the key period, the launching pad for the nuns to rise. They were basically very flat from 1972 to about 1990 or so. And then just boom, just took off like a rocket from 1990 to now. So that's where they came from.
How would you say, it sounds like this isn't being talked about a lot, as much. So how do you say that this affects just your research around the nuns affects how we in America should be thinking about, or maybe we're not thinking about the religious landscape accurately.
Yeah. No, I think for a long time we just didn't talk about the nuns because they were a small part of the population. It's easy to overlook groups that aren't that big. And so for a long time they weren't that big. It was just, for when you're 5% of America, that's pretty small. Even on a survey, even a big survey, you only get, 50 of you, 75 of you. So it's hard to really make conclusions. And so it's really been a confluence of two things. One is that the share of the American population has gotten bigger. So we talk about now the 30% of America, But the other thing is, like, social science has gotten a lot better in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of sample size. So now, like, I'm just looking at a survey right now that's 61,000 people in it. So if 30% of America is nuns, that's 18,000 respondents. So now I can look at women, I can look at men, I can look at, people of color, I can look at white people, I can look at young people. I can do all these things with that data for both reasons. They've grown larger, but also the surveys have grown larger. So now it's like all these doors have opened up for us to understand things that were just not understandable in any real way, even 15 years ago. So part of it is just we weren't looking for it, but part of it was just really practical, logistical stuff that makes it a lot easier now to do this kind of work. It just wasn't possible even a decade ago.
So you mentioned the survey, I mean, the sophistication of surveys, and you guys are like compiling all this data now. Like when you zoom in on the nuns, right? The groups of people you mentioned, women, like different races.
Yeah.
How would you describe, to better understand, who these nuns are?
Yeah. So they're everybody and everywhere. I mean, I think that's I hope the book makes that clear, is that it's not whatever you have in your head of the nuns, that's not it. Because the nuns now are male and female. They're black and white and Asian, Hispanic, Latino. They're everybody. They're young, they're old, they're educated, they're less educated. They have high incomes, they have low incomes. I mean, when you get to be 30% of the population, you've got to be pretty darn, diverse in every possible way. So the nuns are your neighbors, your friends, your family sometimes. So they're all over the place. Now, and I think really the big contribution of the book, I feel like, is really breaking the nuns down into 3 separate categories. And that is atheists, agnostics, and a group called nothing in particular. And so let's just go through each of those individually really quick. Atheists are 6% of the population. They are probably what you have in your mind when I say nuns. After you realize it's not N-U-N-S, when you think N-O-N-E-S, you realize it's atheists are probably who you think about, right? And that's probably because your pastors sort of used atheists as like a boogeyman, like like Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris or these kind of famous atheists. Atheists they check all the boxes in your head of what you think the nuns look like. They are highly educated. 45% of them have a college degree, which makes them one of the most educated religious groups in America today. They have higher incomes than the average American. They're predominantly male. They're overwhelmingly white. So, that kind of conception you have in your head of atheists is actually true, but here's where it's not necessarily as true, that atheists are only 6% of the population. Now, agnostics are also 6% of the population, and they look a lot like just a little bit less of a version of atheists, a little less education, a little less income, a little less white, a little less male, but still, politically pretty far to the left of center, vote for Democrats, a little bit less than atheists do, also 6%. So that's 6% plus 6%. How do we get to 30%? Well, the other 19% or so are a group called nothing in particular, which is literally the response option at the bottom of the survey. It gives you 11 options, actually 12 options, and the last one is something else, but the one before that is nothing in particular. So you can be atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. I call that the shrug category. You look at the religion question and go, I don't know. Like, I'm not any of these things. I'm not Protestant, I'm a Catholic, I'm not Buddhist or Mormon or Muslim. I'm not an atheist. I guess I'm a nothing in particular. And that is, like I said, about 1 in 5 Americans today is nothing in particular. It was 14% in 2008. Now it's 21% today. So a really, really large increase, like 7% over 12 years in religious demography is huge, huge growth. So we think about 6% are atheists, 6% agnostic, and then 19% are nothing in particular. You realize, like, nothing in particular are 60% of the nuns are nothing in particular, right? So they're the biggest group. They are an interesting group because they are sort of the mirror opposite of atheists. They have very low incomes. They're the least educated religious tradition in America today. 19% of them have a 4-year college degree. It's 44% of atheists. So incredibly, lower educated, both male and female. All races are represented in this group because, again, it's 20% of America. But to lump atheists in with nothing in particulars is really to gloss over these tremendous differences between the two. And, I think hopefully if the book does anything, it will make people go, that's not what the nuns look like. What I had in my head is not what the majority of the nuns look like. The majority of the nuns look like you or me. I mean, they look like the average American. They're not like, Nietzsche quoting philosophy professors wearing tweed jackets or tech bros who live in Silicon Valley, making $200,000 a year. A lot of nuns make $50,000 a year or less, have a couple kids. They're in their 30s and 40s. They're struggling to get by. They feel, they don't participate in politics in any meaningful way either. So they're not really connected to education. They're not really connected to a church. They're not really connected to society. They're not really connected to politics. A lot of them, I think of them as sort of disconnected, checked out, unmoored from the rest of society. I'm less worried from a political science sense about atheists, because a lot of them have education, they have income, they have networks, they have a good life. Nothing in particular, as many of them are struggling mightily. And that to me, and in the book, I talk about this. If you look at atheists over a 4-year period of time, almost all of them are still atheists over 4 years. And same for agnostics. Almost all of them are either atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. But here's what's super interesting. Of nothing in particulars, 4 years later, 60% of them are nothing in particular still. 20% of them become atheists or agnostics, but 20% of them become part of a religious tradition again. So, it's really, they're a group that's a lot more flexible, malleable, variable in the way they move around the religious landscape. And they're actually probably much more receptive to hearing arguments from a Christian than they would be, than an atheist or agnostic would be. I wrote an article for the Gospel Coalition 2 weeks ago where I said, stop wasting your time debating atheists. It's really just, it's an intellectual, exercise that doesn't really have any real benefits. So, we should focus more on looking, and listen, when we talk about atheists, are only 6% of the population. Nothing in particular are 3.5 times that size. So focus on the bigger group. Don't get lost, yelling about Sam Harris. Focus on this big group. That's probably your neighbors, your friends, people living next door to you.
It sounds a little bit like I don't know, like just a little apathetic or a little bit meh, or a little bit like, they could be convinced, but at this moment, there's nothing that church down the street is really offering me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think apathetic is the right word, and thing is, apathy is lethal. We don't think about it that way, but apathy is lethal. Like I hate to go back to like the Nazis reference, because everyone goes back to the Nazis, but the reason that Hitler rose to power was because of apathy amongst a large swath of the German population. They just did not stand up to the Nazi, regime. Apathy doesn't get you nowhere in life.
So not strongly opinionated, willing to be persuaded by
exactly
those who might have a strong sense of giving a sense of purpose or identity to them.
Yep. And they're stuck. I think a lot of them feel like society has left them behind. And I talk in the book about globalization, like as a concept, that globalization is this idea that, why are American jobs going overseas? That's because it's cheaper to make stuff in China than it is America. Like, let's just be completely frank about it. No matter how much money we want to spend in America to try to stop that, it's happening, right? And I think globalization has hurt a lot of these nothing in particulars a lot, because we know the kind of jobs that do go overseas are the unskilled, lower educated, like factory style manufacturing jobs, because it's just easier to make it in China than it is in America. Those are the people who are sort of casualties of globalization. And because they've been so hurt by the economic system, I think they pull back from every system that sort of undergirds the American world. And I think that's where we really get in these, we talk about, there's this term called deaths of despair, which are things like drug overdoses, cirrhosis, and suicide. We're seeing a rapid increase in deaths of despair. I think a lot of it is tied to this idea of people feel left out, left behind, disconnected. We are meant to live in community with each other. Like, that is not just a Christian idea. That's a psychological and sociological concept, right? So solitary confinement is considered to be a war crime now by many psychiatrists, because they understand that human beings need connection with other human beings. And I think nothing in particulars are definitely in that edge of they're not getting that. They're not getting the connection they need. And think about this, especially with COVID, right? How many people got fired or laid off? Their job went away. They're working from home. How much disconnected they are. These are the people I think that the church really would do. They would do society a favor. Let's just take the salvation, the theology out of it. They would do a society a huge favor by trying to integrate these people back into their communities and making them feel connected to other people. That builds trust. It builds tolerance. It builds a sense of community and togetherness. It builds what we call social capital, which are these invisible bonds that tie you to place, making you feel like you belong, and that you care about the school, even though that your kids don't go to school, or you care about the park, even though you don't use the park. You just care about your community. That's what churches used to be really good at, is these bridge building exercises, these bond creating exercises. And I think we've missed out on that part, because I think we've become so convinced that church is about theology. And I think we forget at some level that church is a social organization with a theology piece to it. And that churches, we call it like the vertical versus the horizontal. Churches got obsessed with the vertical and forgot the horizontal. Like, your connection with other people in some ways is salvific, right? It saves you from yourself. So that's
God, loving your neighbor, you can't separate them, right?
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
So, I mean, I know that in your book, you don't go too far into like the so what. How should those who read this data get a better sense from what you're writing about, this skyrocketing of this category of nuns, especially the nothing in particulars? They read this book, they're okay, it informs me about what's going on. Maybe it helps you understand the people that you know around you. But yeah, what would you say as a so what? I mean, if you had just some suggestions. I know you're a pastor yourself, so I'm sure that you've also tried to think about that in your own Christian context.
So in the book, I talk about the thing we need to be careful about is dividing things into things we can change and things we can't. And I think that's a very helpful way to think about the world. And the macro level stuff is secularization. I used to, when I was a young pastor, I was a big believer in what John Wesley said about, if you set yourself on fire, people will come to watch you burn. And my first church, I tried to preach my guts out and we didn't get any bigger. Second church, same thing. Third church, same thing. And it's easy to get depressed, right? Like, I'm not doing my job. I'm not preaching well. I'm not being a good minister. I'm not being a good pastor. I'm not being a good Christian. But you got to understand, it's really hard to grow a church in a community that's declining in size, right? Like, there are things that are working against pastors right now. So if your church is getting smaller, you need to understand probably the reason it's getting smaller is probably not because of anything you did or did not do. It's because of macro level stuff, like large scale stuff. However, there are some things you can change. And the one thing in the book I kind of point to pretty specifically is stop being so political, or stop being so partisan, is what I really should say amongst pastors is, especially amongst white Christians, white Christianity has become closer and closer linked with the Republican Party. And I think that's objectively a bad thing for America, for the church, for communities, because what it's essentially saying is, if you're a moderate Democrat, this is not for you, right? Like, the church is, I'm a big believer that church was the best when it has independents and moderates and liberals and conservatives and capitalists and socialists all together under one roof, right? Because that's when we had conversation, honest conversation, in good faith with each other about politics. Because I don't think the Bible speaks with one voice on things like the estate tax or gun control, right? There are many different interpretations of the Bible, and you can use one to back up any point you want to make. The problem is that pastors basically started towing the line on the conservative side. And it's not just from the pulpit, it's also on social media. I have so many pastor friends who just post nothing but anti-Democrat stuff or pro-Republican stuff, right? It's all one-sided. Pastors, Michael Jordan said it best. He was asked one time, why are you not more political? And he said, hey, man, Republicans buy sneakers too, right? Like, Democrats deserve Jesus too, don't they? And if you say no, then we got a problem. Like, that to me is, if you're going to give it to one side, give it to the other side. Here's my approach. Either you are completely apolitical or you're bipartisan in your criticism. Pick one. Yeah. You cannot do anything else if you want your church to grow.
I'm more for number two, or
I'm actually skeptical. I am too.
I'm actually skeptical you can be apolitical when you say Jesus is Lord, right?
No, I think you're right. I think, to me, and that's the approach I take, I give it to both parties equally. Like, there are things about the Republican Party that I think are repugnant and morally wrong. And I think there are things about the Democratic Party that I think are repugnant and morally wrong, right? And I think that the key is to point out that nobody speaks for Jesus except the Bible, right? So why not? Here in the book, I talk about this idea, like, we need to bring back the idea of a biblical worldview, not a part like a Republican or a Democratic worldview. And, I talk about Imago Dei, which is this idea that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God. And I think that's a nonpartisan way to look at the world, which means that, yes, I care about the unborn, but it also means I care about the illegal immigrant too, right? I care about the disabled. I care about the young. I care about the white. It lets me say things like Black Lives Matter and really mean it, because every life matters to God, because it was created in the image and likeness of God, right? So if we sort of take on a biblical worldview, it challenges all our entire political principles. I had a friend one time, we were talking about bringing in Syrian refugees, and she's like, I looked through the entire Bible and I could not find a single spot where it said we should take in Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, are you really kidding me? Because I can point out 3 or 4 passages right now about welcome the stranger. Like, literally the most repeated of the 613 Deuteronomic laws is welcome the stranger, welcome the stranger, welcome the stranger. Like, that is what that society was based on. And you are reading the Bible in a sheerly political way. There's no way to other look at it besides that. So I think it should challenge us. The Bible should challenge both parties and our own partisanship. And unfortunately, pastors are unwilling to be courageous and do that.
Yeah. On that note, I could attest to my friend who was a Syrian refugee here in the United States, in Philadelphia, for 4 or 5 years actually, and he had a terrible experience. She went back to Syria. Would prefer to be there, even though he had refugee status, that he could stay here. And even in a city that wanted to be really embracing. So yeah, I'm with you there, brother. I'm with you there. Well, I mean, I found your work provocative. I don't know if provocative is the right word. I found it interesting to be able to kind of add some flesh meat onto this bones of like this broader category of nuns. I've heard about this phenomenon of nuns growing. I wanted to do this recording because I want to kind of bring more attention to it, because I think that if we're not thinking about that reality, it's just not helpful for anybody, right? Yeah. So I hope that this book gets a further reading. Maybe I'll do this. Some people are on social media, so I'm gonna share my screen here. This is your Twitter, right?
It is. Oh, that's where the magic happens.
That's where the magic happens. It's also where a lot of messy things happen, I've heard, on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
But I guess, what is it? Ryan Burge. So if you want to follow, go ahead. Yeah, I pray that your work, you can continue to do interesting work. I know that you study how digital things affect the broader landscape as well. I mean, what are some, you could just list a couple of other your interests in what you're studying that can help us out?
Yeah, so I wrote a couple papers on the emergent church. That was like my first research agenda. I write about the nuns, obviously, because that's a big thing that I'm interested in. Religious measurements, a lot of what I do. But I also look at things like how evangelicals are using Twitter to communicate. Evangelical leaders are using Twitter to communicate with their following. I wrote a paper on how women preach differently than men. We have papers in the hopper now about QAnon and religion, about support for women pastors amongst evangelicals. We have a book in the works on non-denominational Christianity and what that means for the future of America. So really, I'm just all over the place. I just grab onto an idea and run with it. If you like religion and you like politics, you're probably going to like the stuff I do. You can check me out. RyanBurge.net is my personal website. All my papers I've ever written are on there, including the published ones. Again, on Twitter at Ryan Burge. The book is called The Nuns: Where They Came From, Who They Are, Where They're Going. You can buy it on anywhere books are sold. Amazon.com is a good place to start. And you can always email me. I'm easy to find on any sort of platform. My email's out there. I don't hide it.
Yeah. Well, and on this note, I know that one missiologist that I've really respected, Leslie Newbegin, he came back from India as a missionary for a long time, came back to the U.S. and just said, I think of India as a mission field, but the U.S. is a mission field. Like it's really changed, and to think of the U.S. as a place that we don't have to study or better understand. The same way that if you're going to another country, another culture, you got to understand the language, you got to understand the subcultures and what's going on here, so you don't mess things up. In a certain way, if you live in the U.S. now, we have to learn from our social scientists, those people studying religion. We have to not be naive and think that you're sharing this stuff about God, Jesus, whatever, that it's makes any sense to anybody anymore. And so this is my hope. So I hope that your tribe increases, Ryan, that more people like you are trying to wisely do research that can equip others to participate in the cultural conversations and religious conversations here in the U.S. So
Awesome.
thanks so much
Thanks so much.
brother.
Yep. Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it, man.